must also have been envisaged to fend off right-wing identitarian recuperation of his political ontology. What exactly, though, Rancière means by disidentification and the impossible identification with the other, and how exactly this guards against reappropriation of his political ontology, whether by the right or by minoritarian identity politics, is unclear. And it's not particularly elucidated by one of his most inconclusively treated, supposedly illustrative examples, the May 68 slogan, "Nous sommes tous des juifs allemands." Nevertheless, it's perhaps worth remarking that Rancière's account of democracy, sometimes expressed by him in a formula very reminiscent of the closing sentence of Jean-Paul Sartre's Les mots, as premised on l'égalité de n'importe qui avec n'importe qui, Rancière's account of democracy has little to recommend it, on the face of it, to right-wing thinkers with strong attachments to their particular identity, to their roots, to their heritage, to their sense of belonging. It would be very unfair to blame Todd May entirely for the formalism that emerges in his reconstruction of Rancière's vision of equality, and to blame him for the attendant dangers of rightist reappropriation. The following passage from La Mésentente, which is a moment of high formalism in Rancière's account, makes it clear that Rancière himself is, in a certain sense, at certain moments, a radical formalist about politics and about equality. La politique n'a pas d'objet ou de question qui lui soit propre. Son seul principe, l'égalité, ne lui est pas propre et n'a rien de politique en lui-même. Tout ce qu'elle fait est de lui donner une actualité sous forme de cas, d'inscrire sous la forme du litige la vérification de l'égalité au cœur de l'ordre policier. Ce qui fait le caractère politique d'une action, ce n'est pas son objet ou le lieu où elle s'exerce, mais uniquement sa forme, celle qui inscrit la vérification de l'égalité dans l'institution d'un litige, d'une communauté n'existant que par la division. There is a danger inherent in Rancière's egalitarianism that its radical formalism leaves it open to the politicization of any kind of grievance. Now, in my view, there's nothing internal to Rancière's work which succeeds in preventing this recuperation, even if the examples of political subjectivation that he happens to choose, rather like Todd May's, are reassuringly left or indeed leftist. But I'd argue that it's therefore all the more important to resist the move that May makes in systematically opposing Rancière's work to normative political theory and downplaying the value of the latter. Rancière's formalist account of politics is neither total nor is it sufficient on its own. And this isn't a defect, as I've said before. It simply means that what it's good at doing is describing the way in which those who are excluded voice their grievances or come to voice their grievances, how it is that they come to articulate the tort of their exclusion. It's by its very nature unable and unwilling to evaluate and arbitrate between the content of those grievances, between the particular inequalities expressed. There just is no normative dimension to Rancière's political ontology. It's therefore, I think, all the more important that we don't seek to make out that it's somehow all that we need, whoever we exactly are. Still less that it's superior to anything that came before it. So in the paper so far, I've been trying to situate Rancière's political ontology by saying what it is and what it isn't capable of doing, in my view or opinion. I've criticised one influential reconstruction of his thought in terms of active equality, and so far I've mainly been focusing on what is, if you like, the key text of his political theory, mature political theory, La Mésentente. In what remains of the paper, I'm going to look more closely at the other major text, the earlier book on Joseph Jacotot, Le Maître Ignorant, subtitled 5 leçons sur l'émancipation intellectuelle. Now, in almost every published account of the book on Jacques Couture, of which there are several, you find at about this point, as though by decree, a recitation of the story of Joseph Jacques Couture, more or less in the terms in which Rancière himself recounts it in the book. I'm going to do the same in a minute, I have to, but what I want to draw attention to is the curious phenomenon, this curious phenomenon, because I think it points to something significant about the book itself. It's as though there were no getting away from the Jacques Couture book in its materiality, the materiality of the book, no way of distancing by conceptualization the very matter or matière of Jacques Couture's peculiar teaching. I'm going to return to say a bit more about that point in a minute, but first the narrative. So Joseph Jacques Couture, born in 1770, died in 1840, begun his working life teaching rhetoric in Dijon before being swept up by the French Revolution. He fought in an artillery regiment on the side of the New Republic in 1792, and he went on to work at the War Ministry and the École Polytechnique. He returned to teaching in Dijon, but was forced into exile under the Bourbon Restoration, exile in Holland, and he obtained there a teaching post in Louvain. But unfortunately, he could speak no Flemish, and none of his students could speak any French. Strange position to be in, I think. He resorted to giving the students a bilingual edition of a book by Fénelon, Télémaque, which had recently been published. And through the good offices of an interpreter, he asked them to read the first half of the first chapter or first book of Télémaque, to repeat back to him what they'd read, and then to read the rest of the text. Then he asked the students to write in French about what they'd just read, and he was astonished to find that they could do so in fluent, literate French without his having had to explain anything. And although it was his own incapacity to speak their language and theirs his, which had led to this rather unusual approach, in retrospect it took on the feel of one of those experiments in pedagogy so common under the Enlightenment. Jacques Couture thought the experiment showed that what was normally considered to be the main business of education, the delivery of explanations by a teacher to students, was in fact unnecessary. And indeed, to prove the point, he radicalized the experiment by setting about trying to teach things about which he didn't know anything at all, painting, piano playing, constitutional law and other things. And this is where the title of Rancière's book comes from, Le Maître Ignorant. The results history records were impressive. From these experiments, brought on by necessity, Jacques Couture elaborated his pedagogical method of intellectual emancipation. And it's the political meaning of this method which Rancière is most interested in, and I'm going to talk about in a minute. The traditional pedagogy based on explaining was, according to Jacques Couture, premised on the intellectual inequality of teacher and student. What such teaching sought to do was to gradually lead the student through a hierarchy of ever more complex explanations. But Jacques Couture's experiment seemed to suggest that better results could be achieved if the teacher started out by presuming the student were his intellectual equal. It is a he in the text. Instead of dispensing explanations, the teacher would simply place the students in a situation in which they had to find their own way through the material. In the case of the original experiment, through Fénelon's Télémaque. Rather than dispensing content, as it's sometimes called in today's pedagogical parlance, the role of the Jacques Coutiste pedagogue is to be an intractably, uncompromisingly, inflexibly demanding presence who verifies the quality of his students' attention. And he does this by getting them to recite and reiterate what they've learned, and by refusing to allow them to waver from their course. And Jacques Couture himself was keen to explore the political implications of his particular pedagogical method. And it was his conviction that it would allow the unschooled father in a working class family to educate his children without needing to send them to an established educational institution, which probably couldn't afford to pay in any case. And Jacques Couture's method threatened, of course, established educational institutions, which it seemed to suggest were irrelevant or unnecessary, but it also seemed very threatening to many in power in the day because it evoked the terrifying political spectre, indeed the revolutionary prospect of the unwashed masses succeeding in educating themselves. For Rancière, Jacoto's method is the very opposite of so-called progressive pedagogy, pedagogy which sees education as the route to greater social equality. So-called progressive pedagogy places intellectual and social equality as the end result, the goal to be achieved. By progressive pedagogy, Rancière has in mind both the Third Republic's confidence in limited greater equality achieved through extension of elementary schooling, the instituteur, and closer at hand, at least at the time of writing, and this is a point that Kristin Ross makes very succinctly in her introduction to the English translation of Le Maître Ignorant. He also had in mind as a target the progressive pedagogical reforms inspired by Pierre Bourdieu's work in the early years of the Mitterrand presidency. Rancière's polemical claim is that such a view of what education is essentially reinforces the existing status quo by starting out from a presupposition of inequality, which it cannot but proceed to verify. Now, there's so much in Rancière's seductive little book on Jacotot. The way in which Rancière's and Jacotot's voices merge and separate, as well as the unusual mix of narrative and discursive modes, makes for a density of material texture, which I think is itself significant. I said a minute ago that I found it intriguing that the way in which those who try to account for the book, as I've done several times and now doing again, inevitably end up retelling whole chunks of it in the course of their exposition. And of course this is very similar, very reminiscent of the way in which Jacotot's own pedagogical experiment operates through a certain kind of recitation. One of the politico-pedagogical points which Jacotot and Rancière want to convince the reader of is that learning to talk about Fénelon is not essentially different from making shoes or making locks. Anyone can learn to do any of these things given the desire and the application to do so, and no particular class of person is in any sense destined or intrinsically better suited to one particular kind of work, be it intellectual or manual, working on ideas or working on material objects. What does it mean then to start out from the presupposition of intellectual equality and seek to verify it? Surely some people just are more clever than others, or better at some things than others. Not according to Rancière's Jacotot, or Jacotot's Rancière, who claims that, and I'm quoting here, il y a inégalité dans les manifestations de l'intelligence selon l'énergie plus ou moins grande que la volonté communique à l'intelligence pour découvrir et combiner des rapports nouveaux, mais il n'y a pas de hiérarchie de capacité intellectuelle. There's no such thing in absolute terms as stupidity in Rancière's Jacotisme, although there's certainly something called intellectual laziness, which looks very like stupidity. One of the main functions of the Jacotist teacher is to continually prompt the student to reformulate their thoughts, and never to treat any particular attempt which the student produces as providing the basis for definitive judgment of their intellectual capacity. Rather, simply as the manifestation of that capacity, a manifestation which they can improve upon in their subsequent efforts, given, as I mentioned, given sufficient desire on the part of the student, and I suppose I'd add also